Hello everyone, my name is Brandon Cunningham. I am the executive chef up at Greeno, which is a resort within a resort up at Paws Up. I am here at the Missoula Public Library, and I want to thank them first of all for having me, and also to MCAT as well for being able to film this and maybe take away some of the mistakes that I might make throughout this process. So today's video is going to be about getting folks comfortable with the sourdough bread baking process. So that starts off with, first of all, the starter. We're going to teach you how to cultivate any wild yeast that we're going to find in the Montana air and form that into a natural leavening agent, which is the starter itself. From that point, we will walk through the process of making a naturally leavened sourdough bread without the use of any additional dry active yeast and all of that. So, and then we'll go through shaping, proofing, baking, and then at some point we will slice into a loaf and show you the finished product. So, with sourdough, first and foremost, it does take a long process to start and to finish. Your starter, for instance, can take up to 7 days to fully activate. That process is where you're essentially extracting any wild yeast from the air, and wild yeast is all around us. It's in the air, it's in the soil, it's in vegetables, some of it's even on your fingers, believe it or not. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of extract that, and different sources of wild yeast that you can kind of grab onto and utilize in your own kitchen. So the first thing is first, we're going to talk about the starter. So to begin your starter, you just need a couple of simple ingredients: all-purpose flour, whole wheat flour, and tap water. Essentially, is all you need. The rest of the process takes place inside of a bowl or whatever container you choose to make your starter in. You are essentially just mixing those three ingredients together to help attract any wild yeast that we find in the air. The yeast latches onto that and slowly starts to kind of essentially ferment your flour and your water mixture. So we'll include a recipe off to the side here that will go through the process of starting your starter, feeding your starter, and keeping it alive throughout the process. I did bring a starter along with me a little bit here. This one I made just over a year ago up at Paws Up, so I've been keeping it alive ever since, and we do a lot of sourdough baking in the restaurant for dinner service. Brought some of the samples here as well. So the first thing you want to do with your starter is you want to create a little poolish, basically. So you want to take equal parts flour and water and mix those together. And that's really all you need to do to start. You want to get maybe a thin towel, some cheesecloth, and cover that mixture up and let it sit for 24 hours. That's going to start the process of attracting any of the wild yeast you might find in your home, outside, and any other sources of wild yeast out there. The next day, you're going to take about 3/4 of that starter out, discard it. It's not alive yet, so it is kind of a sacrificial lamb there, but take about 3/4 of that away and feed your starter equal parts flour and water again. So if you start off with 2 cups water, 2 cups of flour, you'll want to take about 3/4 of that away, and the next day feed it another 2 cups of water and 2 cups of flour. So over the course of 5 to 7 days, you'll do that same process every day. Now and again, you want to keep it on the counter, have it exposed to some sort of air, so you can get some some wild yeast attracted into that. And after about 5 to 7 days, you'll start to see some real good movement, some bubbling going on in the starter, and it'll certainly look alive, and you'll know when you've achieved a full mature starter. So now your starter's ready to go. Any future discard you have with this starter, you can certainly use for things like pancakes, waffles, muffins, beignets, scones, all sorts of different things that you can use. It gives it a little bit different texture, but the flavor I think you'll notice is it gives it that little bit of a sour sort of tang to it. So don't be afraid to use some of that in addition to your pancake batter or what have you. It'll stay alive as long as you keep feeding it every day. Now, if feeding your sourdough starter seems like a chore every day, there is certainly opportunities to kind of put that in cold storage for a little bit, and it'll stay healthy and alive for quite a while. So if you wanted to store your starter in your fridge, you have at least 30 days until you need to pull that starter out, Again, taking away about 3/4 of that and refeeding it the night before you want to use it on that following day. But you can certainly keep it in the fridge and just kind of forget about it for a few weeks without having to feed it every single day. Okay, so your starter is complete. It's fully activated, it's mature, and you are ready to use it. Let's start with making the bread. So this particular recipe, once again, it's 100% leavened by our starter and no, commercially produced yeast. So it does take a little bit longer for this bread to come to fruition, if you will, but it's certainly worth the end result. So what I have here is the aforementioned starter that we've already pre-measured it. So again, we'll have recipes for this particular bread along with this video, so you can easily follow along. One thing that I recommend if you're going to get serious about bread baking, cups, tablespoons, teaspoons, those are all great. Kitchen digital scale is, in my opinion, very important when it comes to bread baking. It's much more exact. A cup of flour that I scoop is going to weigh far different than a cup of flour you scoop. Obviously, water is pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of variables involved when you start dealing with cups and tablespoons. If you transfer that over to grams, ideally, or even just ounces, you'll get a far more accurate reading, and you'll have a far more consistent product with your bread. So with that being said, I've got our pre-weighed flour out here. This is about 5 1/4 cups or 804 grams. So this is just standard all-purpose flour. This is actually from Wheat, Montana, here in town. So the first thing we want to do is a process called Autolease. Now, Autolease is important because it allows the flour and the water to become homogenized. It essentially allows the flour to hydrate a lot better than it would if you had the presence of salt. So salt deters flour from being fully hydrated with the water. So this process will allow us to get a fully hydrated flour, and as well as change and in a good way the structure and texture of the bread as well. So I've got my all-purpose flour and my whole wheat flour, and I'm going to add the predetermined amount of water to that. So this process is really just as simple as kind of bringing these two together. Again, it's called an autolease. So we're allowing the flour to bond with the water before we introduce our salt and our starter or levain. So we're just going to make a shaggy dough out of this. You don't have to really work it too much quite yet. And this recipe also is a no-knead bread. You don't need a machine. You don't you don't need a dough hook and a KitchenAid or an electric mixer. All you need is your hands, and it really doesn't take a whole lot of work even. And I'll show you that a little bit later on. But so this process here, again, the Autolease, we're just going to let that sit just like that. Very simple to do. That's going to sit for about 20 minutes. And during that time, let that rest. So I will show you the next step here in a moment, but I do want to, and one thing I'm doing right now is I'm using gloves for sake of being on video. Like I mentioned before, there are some traces of wild yeast on your hands, and it's actually recommended that you use bare hands on this. You're introducing some of your own wild yeast into your bread, and it's certainly not going to hurt your final product whatsoever. But for ease, I'm using gloves at this point. So here we've got our completed dough. This does have the starter and the salt in it after I let it rest. And again, all you're doing is just kind of working in the starter and the salt in a pincher method, and I'll show you that when we hop back over to here. But I do want to show you the folding technique that I've kind of worked with mostly. So you've got your bread. This is enough for 2 loaves here. Same recipe that we have over here. So folding the bread, this is where you really start to work the gluten. This is where you form your structure and you get that nice chewy sort of dense texture and flavor. It's from this process right here. So very simple way to fold it. We're going to do this 4 times over the course of about 2 hours. And all we're doing is we're lifting up from one corner and folding in, quarter turn, lifting up and folding in, quarter turn, lifting up, folding in, and then one more time, to go all the way around. We're going to do that 4 times. So I count to 16. I know I've gone around 4 times. And what this does is, again, it kind of reinforces the gluten structure, gives you a really nice texture, and you're just stretching out those gluten strands a little bit. So do this quite a few times, going over. I'm just lifting and folding in and turning. Lifting. As you go, you'll see that the bread starts to get stiff. It gets more and more stiff as you fold it, and so that's when you know you're doing the right thing here. When your bread relaxes, it's very easy, but the more you go, the tougher and kind of the shorter the strands get. And then we'll allow this to rest for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we will go into our next fold as well. So again, you do this about 4, even 5 times to kind of get a really good chewy sort of texture going on. And then always flip it over, make a nice little boule, and then we'll let that rest, and we'll go back into folding here in a little bit. So we have allowed this to rest for 20 minutes or so to let that flour get absorbed by the water, into the water. Our next step is to introduce our salt and our starter. So first thing is we want to add in our salt. I like to just sprinkle that all around, and then our weighed out starter goes in next. Now, if you ever wanted to introduce any sort of extra ingredients, whether it's toasted nuts, fresh herbs, roasted garlic, my personal favorite, bacon, this is the time to do it as well. So what you want to do is what's called the pincher method. So I like to kind of get this flour mixture, and it's already kind of homogenized. It's already become this, this mass here. So I want to get these guys introduced just a little bit, and then I'll start what's called, again, the pincher method. So it starts like this. You're essentially taking your middle finger and your thumb and you're pinching it together. This helps us avoid overworking the flour too much. It's a really easy way to get everything worked in without having to fold it over and over and really overwork the gluten in the flour. So I would do this. I would go around about 3 or 4 times, and again, I'm just pinching. This will give you a little bit of a forearm workout, but it's a good one. Just pinching and turning as I go around. I will give the bowl a little bit of a scoop, let it rest, and then continue pinching until I feel like I've gotten, the levain or the starter and the salt fully mixed in. So that's that step there. Now, this mixture will sit for, again, about another 20 minutes. And then eventually you'll end up with the bread that we just folded here. It'll become a lot smoother. It'll become a little bit drier than it initially starts out as, because that flour is still in the process of absorbing all of that water. So our next step is we're going to go through the portioning process. This bread has been folded the prerequisite amount of times, which is 4 times. It feels good, it looks smooth, so our portion on this, since we did enough for 2 rolls or 2 boules, you can eyeball it. At the resort, I like to weigh these out. They usually come to about 850 grams, but we're cooking at home, right? So we're just going to eyeball this guy. Now, there's 2 processes to the shaping aspect of it. The first thing is called a pre-shape. So this bread, this flour, it doesn't know what's going on right now. We want to kind of train it a little bit into the final shape that we want. So we're going to give it a rough circular kind of boule shape. Doesn't have to be pretty because we're going to do a final one on it here in a little bit. And you can use your hands on this. I found this dough card here is a super handy tool for bread baking. We just kind of want to get it into a nice circular shape. And again, we're just kind of training these gluten strands to finally form into a boule. So let those rest for about 20 minutes. and then we'll jump into the next step once these are ready. All right, so our loaves have sat here for about 20 minutes. They are trained. They know their next move, and we know what we're going to do with them next. So it's relaxed a little bit easier to work with. A couple different ways you can choose to proof your loaf. You do need some sort of vessel, obviously, to kind of help facilitate the shape and to kind of keep it nice and tidy while it's proofing. Banneton, which is your French kind of wicker baskets that you can flour and use those. Those are obviously a great option. What we've kind of settled on is a linen from the resort, but you could use a very thin kitchen towel. Anything that has very little to no lint is important. You don't want any of that lint getting stuck in your bread. I don't want to eat a towel. I don't think you guys do either. So very important though is to flour your cloth, probably more than you think, because even though this bread is, it's tacky. Once it rests and rests against this towel, it will stick. And I've had a couple, I wouldn't say disasters, but I've had some frustrating moments trying to peel away a gently proofed boule out of one of these towels. So I've been sure to make doubly sure that I have plenty of flour on this towel to avoid any sticking. And if there's a lot on it when you go to turn your roll over, you can just kind of brush some of that off gently. But it's not going to hurt anyone at the end of the day. I would like to flour the inside of my bowl as well, just to be extra cautious. So I'll slide this in just like this. And now that's ready for us to proof our roll. So again, I have our bowl here. Step one is to basically just kind of bring it towards you, cupping your hands against. If you need a little flour, then by all means. You do want the bottom of the bowl to have some friction against the table, or else it's just going to kind of slide around all over the place. So don't overuse your flour on this part here, but if you need some on your hands, by all means. So I'm cupping and just kind of gently bringing it towards me, and then making quarter turns as we go. You're going to see the skin of the bread start to tighten up a little bit on you, and that's exactly what you're going for. You want this, you basically kind of get in this shape nice and tight. That's going to help with your proofing process, give you nice, even, consistent looking boules. So you want to do this, probably go around 3 or 4 times again, like we did with the folding aspect of it. And as I start to feel it getting tighter and tighter, I'm going to kind of lock in this shape by just going around and around. You're basically just kind of using the palm of your hands to get it to that nice circular shape that you want. So that's it. At this point, we're ready to start proofing. One big important step on this is to make sure you go seam side down. So we have a very nice kind of rustic looking loaves over here. There's no scoring involved. This is really just bread au naturel, essentially. And the reason we do it seam side down is because we're going to cook it seam side up. So when you are baking bread, a lot of gas is involved from the fermentation process, from the yeast, from the starter. That has to go somewhere. So the gases are going to find the weakest part of the bread, and they're going to go that way. So if you put your seam down on the bottom, your bread is going to essentially do this on the bottom of the loaf, and you want that to be on the top. So you always want to cook with basically your weakest point, and that would be where the seam is. So our seam's on the bottom. I'm going to lift this up. I'm going to give it just a little bit of a crease here to kind of tighten it up once more. But then the bottom will go towards the bottom. We'll proof with the seam side down. And then we will go through the baking process here in a moment, and we'll go from there. Okay, so we just went through our shaping process. Now we move on to proofing. So proofing, there's a lot of different variables that you can run into with how quickly or how slowly your loaves will proof. One of those would be how much starter you add to it. Now, of course, if you use a digital scale, you'll know exactly how much you're putting into your loaves. If you use a cup measurement, which I will make sure to include both for anyone who doesn't have a scale at home, that cup can change drastically from by a variance of ounces, I would imagine. So which isn't a bad thing. It just means you need to keep a closer eye on your bread because it's going to move a little bit quicker, or at least a little bit different than some other loaves. So also temperature. Temperature is a big aspect in proofing bread. I can take this loaf right here and put it in the fridge overnight, and it'll slowly ferment and proof where I can wake up the next day and throw it right in the oven. Or if you wanted to bake it that same day, which is what we usually do, you're looking at it, anywhere between an hour and a half to 4 hours. We're up in elevation up there at Paws Up, and so I experienced after about 90 minutes my bread is usually ready to go, whereas some recipes call for up to 4 hours of fermentation. So even elevation might play a factor into how quickly or how slowly your bread will proof. So a couple of things to note when you're looking for if your bread is ready to go or not, and there's really just a couple. You can certainly see when it's started to expand. So this guy's fluffed up quite a bit, and you can kind of tell it's just gotten kind of pillowy. Now, the finger dent test is another one that's I've learned over the years, is you basically take your pinky and you insert it, and if it springs back out at you very quickly, it's got plenty more time to proof. So, you just take a dent in there, and this guy is slowly coming up. It's leaving a slight indentation where my pinky was, which means that it's pretty much ready to start right now. Now, you can overproof these, obviously. Your window of failure is pretty small. I mean, this sort of bread can be very forgiving. Starter's very forgiving. The sourdough in nature is. Directive yeast can be, because it's such a quick-acting ingredient, it can be pretty volatile, and so you can overproof something a lot quicker with that than you could with a sourdough. So you do have a lot of room for error, but the biggest thing is just to check, make sure that your bread is springing back gently, and there's a little bit of an indentation left. That means you're ready to go. So this cast iron here, there's a couple of ways you can bake off your sourdough. One of those being in your oven with a water bath underneath. You do want to have some sort of steam in your oven or some sort of moisture to keep the outside of the bread moist. If it doesn't, it's going to dry out immediately in the oven, and when the inside goes to rise, it's going to be basically locked in by that hard crust you've already created, and you'll get a really dense and really kind of unpleasant loaf of bread. So I've had my trials and tribulations with cooking in an oven with water pans, and it does take some practice and some kind of trial and error. You could paint on a little bit of water when you on top of your bread when you put it in the oven. That'll help out. Putting a pot in there, get it nice and hot, pour some water in that right before your bread goes in. That'll create some steam in the oven as well. But the tried and true method that I've found, which yields you results like this, is going to be using a Dutch oven. So this Dutch oven, obviously I'm touching it, it's not hot, but it should be. So you want to charge this in your oven at about 425, 450 degrees for at least an hour before you start to bake. So once you get more familiar with the sourdough, you'll know when you're about an hour out. You can see how quickly it's moving, how quickly it's rising, and you'll know when to put your cast iron in there. The charging of it obviously just kind of creates a little oven inside of itself. It's going to allow the bread to basically steam itself open. So charging, that's a very important part of it. Be very careful. I've got multiple burns. We can do 8 to 12 loaves a day up there, and dealing with hot cast irons is not easy, and it's a little bit dangerous, but you certainly get used to it after a while. So just be careful, wear oven mitts when you're dealing with this hot cast iron. So let's just, for all intents and purposes, imagine this thing is screaming hot. We're going to put this onto our counter, and our step next is to take our bread out, and you can just basically just take your linen and just turn it right over, and that's it. As long as you don't have any stickage going on to the thin towel or linen that you use, it's a pretty straightforward process. Now this loaf looks like it might kind of be dead in the water, but what's going to happen in the oven is pretty fun and exciting, at least for me, because it's the way it transforms in the Dutch oven and in the oven is a super fascinating and very rewarding at the end of the process. So we're going to go ahead and put the lid on, and then this goes into our oven. And we're going to bake that at the same temperature that we had the oven set to, between 425 and 450. Obviously, you can play around with your oven. Every oven is different. If you do have a convection oven, I recommend low fan on this. I think even in the Dutch oven on high fan, the crust still tends to kind of solidify on you and prevents, you know, the kind of the expansion that you're looking for in your loaf. So that'll be in there covered for at least 30 minutes. Don't be tempted to peek into it. You want to keep all the steam inside the Dutch oven as long as possible. I'm super guilty of that. I always tend to kind of peek in there, and I always regret it at the end because it might be just a little bit more deflated than you like, or you lose a little bit more of the color. So just keep it on there for the full 30. It's not going to burn in there. It's going to look very pale when you take the lid off. So nothing to keep an eye on until that timer goes off. All right, so our bread has been in the oven for about 30 minutes at between 425 and 450. I'm going to go ahead and take the lid off, and we're going to let this cook for another 15 to 20 minutes, really depending on, again, the temperature of your oven and, you know, a multitude of other sort of variables. But the end result, you're looking for something along the lines of this. You have a little bit of some darker edges. You're looking for kind of like a chestnut color on the outside. And again, right now it's looking a little bit pale, but that's fine because all it was doing was steaming with the lid on. And now we're going to basically cook the crust and get a little bit of color and some caramelization on the outside of the bread. All right, I just took a peek at our bread and it's looking pretty good. So here's our finished product. Again, we got some nice color on the outside. Got some really good, you can kind of see where the gas is expanded out of the bread, and it gives you these kind of like really rustic looking sort of splits, which you know, I'm certainly not opposed to. I think that looks like a gorgeous chunk of bread to me. Now, again, you could do the whole, you know, the fun scoring. It's all over Instagram right now. People are doing a ton of sourdough baking, and they do a lot of intricate scoring, and that's all well and good. But for us and our purposes, just like a nice rustic, really crunchy, crispy sourdough bread here. So, the bread's out of the oven. We've allowed it to cool for at least 25-30 minutes. I know it's very tempting to slice right into this thing, but you're going to end up with a really dry piece of bread if you cut into it too soon. You're allowing all that moisture and steam to escape when it should be reabsorbing into the bread. So do yourself a favor and allow it at least 25-30 minutes to rest before you slice into it. We'll go ahead and do that here. You can hear that nice crunch. And there we go. This here is the our bacon bread. So we just work a little bit of some cooked bacon, a little bit of bacon fat in there, and like we talked about a little bit earlier on. But that's it. So it's a lot of information crammed into a pretty short video. I did save some of the directions, techniques, and recipes will be off to the side on the Missoula Public Library's website for a quick reference, and then use this video as a way to kind of, you know, guide you through the process of it. But you know, look for the recipes. Those will be what you know, a lot of information in there will help you really make your starter. Start making some bread and experiment. You're not going to nail it at the first time, and if you do, congratulations. It's not as easy as you would think, but it is once you do it a couple times. Just like practice makes perfect. Get out there and you know, make your own starter. It's a very rewarding process in of itself. And then, you know, beyond sourdough, there's a multitude of other recipes you could use your sourdough in lieu of any dry or active natural yeast. So again, I'd like to thank the Missoula Public Library for having me, and for MCAT for filming this. Thank you very much.